Sophia Loren had been looked at her entire life. That was the unavoidable fact of her existence. The condition she had been born into, or rather born toward, the thing that had organized every room she had ever entered, and every conversation she had ever had with people who encountered her for the first time. She had learned early and of necessity to look back, not defensively, not as performance, but as an act of genuine reciprocity. The only honest response to being seen so completely and so constantly was to see in return, with equal attention, equal care, equal willingness to understand what was actually in front of you, rather than what you had expected or wished to find there. She had developed, across 6 decades of looking, an eye that functioned with the precision of an instrument built specifically for that purpose. She could read a face the way a musician reads a score. Not just the notes visible on the surface, but the architecture underneath them. The decisions that had been made before the performance began, the things being consciously managed and the things that were breaking through the management despite the person's best efforts. She had worked with directors who possessed this capacity at the level of genius and with actors who had no access to it whatsoever. And she could identify the difference in the first moments of a rehearsal, sometimes in the first exchange of a single conversation. This gift, or discipline, or both, had not come to her automatically. It had been built through years of working in front of cameras that were unforgiving, in front of directors who were demanding, in front of audiences of millions who had strong opinions about who she was and what she was supposed to be. She had survived all of that not by closing herself off from it, but by developing the capacity to see through it, to look past the projection and the expectation and the mythology that accumulated around any person of significant public visibility and find the actual human being underneath. She understood from the inside what it cost to live without that protection. She did not watch much television, not because she dismissed it, but because her attention, when she gave it, was total, and she had learned over decades to be selective about where she directed it. What happened in Rome in the spring of 1992 was not planned. It happened the way certain significant things happen, sideways through a television left on in the corner of a room, in a moment between other moments. The shoot was for a fashion project, a series of photographs that a prominent Italian director was overseeing, the kind of high-end image work that occupied the specific territory between advertising and art, and required the same quality of total presence that a film required, without the temporal dimension that allowed presence to build gradually through a performance. In fashion photography, you had to arrive fully formed. The light was prepared, the camera was waiting, and what you brought to it in the first moment was more or less what the image would contain. Sophia Loren was 57 years old in 1992. She had spent 40 years arriving fully formed at things that required it. She understood the requirement completely and met it without visible effort, which was itself the result of enormous invisible effort. The discipline that looks like ease, because it has been practiced until ease is what it actually is. The director was someone she had worked with several times before, a man whose eyes she respected and whose company she found genuinely enjoyable rather than merely professionally useful. Between setups, they talked with the ease of people who know each other's rhythms, about Rome in that season, about the project, about the particular quality of the light in that part of the city at that hour. A television was on in the corner of the room, left running by someone on the crew who had forgotten to turn it off or had left it on deliberately against the silence of preparation. MTV was playing. It was the kind of channel that Sophia Loren had no meaningful relationship with, not because she dismissed what it represented, but because it existed in a part of the cultural landscape she had simply never had occasion to navigate. Her world was Italian cinema, international film, the specific tradition of European performance culture that stretched back before television existed. Between setups, she noticed the screen. A young man was performing, blonde, deliberately disheveled, wearing clothes that seemed chosen to communicate a complete indifference to the opinion of anyone watching. He was playing a guitar and singing with an urgency that came through the small television speaker in the corner of that Roman room on a spring afternoon, in a way that urgency rarely survives the compression of small speakers and corners of rooms. Usually something is lost in that transmission. In this case, nothing was lost. The thing came through intact. Sophia Loren stopped the conversation she was having. She looked at the screen. "Who is that?" she asked. The director looked at the television. He recognized the band. By the spring of 1992, it was difficult not to recognize them in some basic way, even if your world was European fashion photography rather than American rock. He told her the name. She continued watching the screen without speaking. He watched her watch it and recognized the quality of her attention. That particular focused stillness that he had seen her bring to things that were actually reaching her, rather than merely passing through her field of vision. He had worked with her long enough to know the difference. He said nothing. The performance continued for another minute, maybe two. When it ended, she turned back to the room with the unhurried directness of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they are ready to deliver. "He is not performing," she said. She said it the way she said things she had thought through and was certain of. No qualification, no upward inflection at the end inviting agreement or disagreement. A statement of observed fact. When you perform, there is a layer. You can see it if you know how to look. You can see the decision to present something, the space between the person and what they are showing you. This boy has no layer. What you are seeing is what is actually happening inside him. That is very rare. The director looked at her. "And very dangerous," she added. She turned back toward the preparation for the next shot. "For him." The director held that exchange for a long time without knowing what to do with it. It had the quality of things said in passing that turn out not to be in passing at all. The quality of a precise observation that gains rather than loses weight as time passes and the context around it changes. He had been in rooms with Sophia Loren for enough years to understand that she did not make observations carelessly or for effect. When she named something, she had seen it, and the naming was accurate to what she had seen. What she had named that afternoon was something that the critical language around Nirvana had been circling without arriving at directly. The reviews and the profiles and the cultural analyses were reaching for something, trying to describe the quality that made the music feel so different from music that was technically more sophisticated or more produced or more carefully constructed. The words they kept reaching for were authentic and raw and real, which were true as far as they went, but didn't quite land on the specific thing she had named in 10 seconds of looking at a television screen in Rome. The absence of the layer, the collapse of managed distance between the person and what they were expressing. The specific exposure that made certain kinds of presence devastating to witness and equally devastating over time to maintain. She had named it. She had also, in 3 words, named what that quality of presence cost the person possessing it. Very dangerous, she had said. For him, not for the audience. The audience experienced it as a gift, as something they had rarely felt from a performer before. For him, for the person living inside that exposure without the protection of the layer. She knew what she was looking at because she had spent 60 years watching what happened to people who inhabited that particular condition, who couldn't or wouldn't build the distance between themselves and what they were expressing. She had watched some of them find ways to manage it, to develop the protective layer without losing the truth that lived underneath it. She had watched others who couldn't find that management, and she had watched what it did to them. She had almost been one of them in the early years before she learned what was necessary. She had also spent enough of her own early years without that distance to understand, from the inside, what that condition felt like. The rawness of it, the particular exhaustion of being completely open to everything that came toward you. The way it made certain performances extraordinary and certain lives unsustainable. She had eventually found her own version of the layer. Not a wall, a membrane. Something that let the work through while protecting the person doing the work. Not everyone found it. Not everyone had the time. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994. The director heard the news and thought immediately of the Roman studio, of the spring afternoon, of those 3 sentences delivered with the directness of someone who had seen clearly and was simply reporting what they had seen. He thought of the quality of her attention during those 2 minutes, the focused, diagnostic gaze of someone reading a person rather than watching a performance. He said nothing publicly for years. There was no obvious context for saying it. He was not a music journalist or a cultural commentator. The story lived between him and the memory of the afternoon, and the 3 sentences she had said, and he had no particular reason to move it somewhere else. He mentioned it eventually in a long interview published in an Italian cultural magazine. A conversation about the nature of presence in performance, about what cameras could and couldn't capture, about the difference between technical competence and genuine exposure. The Cobain section appeared near the end, 3 paragraphs introduced as an illustration of something larger that Loren understood about the relationship between visibility and the self. The magazine had a small circulation. The interview attracted limited attention outside its specific readership. It was found eventually by the people for whom it was meant, translated, passed between people who held both Italian cinema and Nirvana in the same sustained attention, who understood without explanation why the story mattered and what it meant that Sophia Loren had seen in 2 minutes what took some observers years to articulate. Most of them said nothing when they read it. They simply held it. The image of Sophia Loren in a Roman studio in 1992, stopping a conversation between setups to watch a television screen in the corner of the room, watching with the focused diagnostic attention she had spent 60 years developing, then turning back to the room with 3 sentences that named something clearly, completely, and without any of the usual language of cultural criticism or musical analysis. No layer. Very rare. Very dangerous. For him, 3 sentences, 2 minutes of watching, 60 years of knowing how to look. There is something in the shape of this particular recognition that is different from others. Sophia Loren was not evaluating technical properties of sound or the structural use of silence in composition. She was doing something more direct and in certain ways more fundamental. She was reading a person. That was what she had spent her life learning to do. Not performing for audiences, but receiving them, looking at faces with the full attention of someone who understood from the inside what it meant to be looked at, and who had developed the capacity to look back with equal depth. She had done this across 6 decades of working under conditions of intense and sometimes overwhelming visibility, and had built from that experience a fluency in reading human presence that was, in its own way, as technical and as hard-won as anything Pavarotti knew about voices or Eastwood knew about frame composition. It was simply applied to a different material. What she read on that television screen was simple and complete, and required no elaboration from anyone who had the same vocabulary. No layer. What you are seeing is what is actually happening inside him. She had read it in 30 seconds from a small screen in the corner of a room, and she had understood, immediately and completely, what it meant for the person she was looking at. Not for the audience, for the person living inside that kind of total exposure without the distance that protects you from it. She said it once. She turned back to work. The light was ready and the camera was waiting, and she had things to do that required her presence. Some recognitions are complete the moment they occur. Some things are seen fully and accurately the first time, by the right eyes, in the right moment, and don't need to be developed or returned to or explained further. Sophia Loren watched Kurt Cobain on a television screen for 2 minutes in Rome in the spring of 1992. She asked who he was. She was told. She said what she saw. She never mentioned it again. He has no layer. What you are seeing is what is actually happening inside him. That is very rare and very dangerous for him. Sophia Loren, to a director, Rome, spring 1992.